Everyone, I think we'll get started here. So hello and welcome to the One World Mathematics of Information, Data, and Signals seminar. Today I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Professor Ronald Coifman. Professor Coifman is the Phillips Professor of Mathematics and Computer Science at Yale University. He has made fundamental contributions to pure and applied harmonic analysis, for example, in wavelet theory and in the use of geometric and analytic tools for extracting patterns from data. For his work, Professor Coifman has received numerous prizes and recognitions, including but not limited to, he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is also a member of the National Academy of Sciences. In 1999, he was awarded the National Medal of Science. And in 2018, he was awarded the Rolf Schock Prize in Mathematics. I will also add, on a slightly more personal note, he's an excellent mentor of postdocs and graduate students. So today, Professor Coifman will be speaking on the analytic geometries of subsets of Rn. And Rafi, and I'll turn the Zoom session over to you. Actually, I think you're muted, Rafi.
Okay, is it okay now? Yeah. So yes. This is a talk I've given various versions of over the years. In particular, this particular talk, the background is a lecture I gave at the International Congress in 2018, which is referenced on this page. The document, which has most of the references for work and collaborators and so on, is listed at the bottom here. My goal today is actually not to repeat necessarily what I did in the past, but in fact, point out that we are dealing with a complex mathematical system in which we are blending analysis, geometry, statistics, combinatorics, and all kinds of ideas coming from various fields like natural language processing or biology, all in a big soup, so to speak. And my goal is to or separate out, if you wish, the components of that and explain the connection. Also try to explain why there is absolutely a need to think more globally. And I would say natural language is sort of the natural paradigm for how you want to organize the world around you. So my goal here is to basically introduce those geometric organizations. So geometry, from my point of view, is the ability to connect various information pieces to each other and understand their relationship, be able to predict how they link. But in particular, what we have discovered, and this has been essentially an idea in mathematics for the last 100 years at least, that you understand geometry of a mathematical object by understanding the functions on that object. So sometimes a function could be complex analysis function, could be solutions of partial differential equations, could be acoustic signatures, and usually the functions came from some physics related to the objects that one was measuring. But in general, the geometry of the object is defined by the functions. So normally the way we do it nowadays, we have a collection of measurements that you do in high dimensions, maybe some profiles of cells, genetic profiles of cells, or vocabulary profiles of documents and so on. Usually you view a cell or a document as an object, and the coordinates are the numbers that you measured on each one of them. The coordinates usually are basically linear functions on the data, and you can use them to organize the data in some ways. You can build all kinds of encoders. I'll address that as we go along. But the idea is that the functions you have on the data define the geometry of the data, and you can view the data points themselves as functions on their functions, okay? So this, in a way, has been known for a long time, that if you have, say, for example, a metric space, you can easily embed the metric space isometrically in the space of functions on the metric space. So that goes back at least 100 years. And so the space of function is some sort of an extension of the data set, but which allows you to better understand and organize the data set. Okay, so this is all pretty abstract. And my goal is to show you how one organizes a given data set in many, many different geometries, in fact, define multiscales on for data analysis, and blend them all together, hopefully in a way that you can understand. The other aspect of what I'm going to discuss is relate this to what is now a very fashionable thing, which is deep neural nets and their capabilities of doing all kinds of miracles in data, and we'll do some of that too. So generally, so this is what I was just saying, the geometry of a subset of Rn can be obtained in various ways. I mean, using the coordinates or using some other functions, say linear functions on the set are coordinates, but you can look at exponentials like e to the I x omega, where omega is some random vector, or you can have a whole collection of random omegas. And you can view this as nonlinear coordinates of the function, or you can look at units which a neural net is generating as basically coordinates of a function. So I'm going to get to examples in a minute, but let me just say that everything I'm describing is a really the work of a global collaboration that includes Amit Aberbuch, Amit Singer, Yanis Kevrikides, Onen Talmon, Matan Gavish, Ophir Lindenstrauss, Ezer Petterford, William Lieb, Gerald Ankerman, Gal Mishneh, Kluger, and Benisti, and many, many more. I would spend 15 minutes going, and that includes Matt Hearn too. So this would go on forever, but let me go back to basics. So what are the basics? The basics are this. I have some database. So my point of view is going to be that everything we are given is a database. A database usually is a matrix where the columns represent certain objects, and the coordinates or the entries of the columns are features of those objects. In general, so a matrix for me is not a linear transformation. It's a database, okay? So we can view it occasionally as a linear transformation, but we're not going to do that because some of the objects are going to be higher order tensors. So a matrix is a two-dimensional tensor. And we'll see that we are forced to deal with higher dimensional tensors in a variety of situations. So the generic situation is this. I have a very structured matrix, which is down at the left hand at this portion of the screen. And somebody permuted the columns for me and the rows in some random way. So maybe each column was a profile of some object, and each row is some features, and the labels of the features are lost, and the names of the people are lost. So what I get is this garbled image. And the question number one is, can I unravel it to reconstruct my original image? And I'll show you various ways of doing that in a minute. But in general, the situation is much more complicated than that. The data you are given is not a single matrix which breaks up into submatrices like this, but it's basically a superposition of matrices breaking up into submatrices. And so you have to unravel the different layers of this data set that you have. So here is an example. We are going to spend quite a bit of time on that example. It's sort of typical. You might think of each column here as representing, say, a cell, say an immune cell or some other cell, and each row as representing the activation or the activity of a given gene in this particular cell. So activation is if it's active, it's white. If it's not, it's black. Or it could be a collection of people, which is what we are going to do, which is a big advantage. So we will look at an actual questionnaire in which each column is a person, and each row is a yes/no response of the question of the person to a collection of 570 questions, and there's 3,000 people. And basically the data that you get looks like this piece of garbage here. And what you want to do out of that is be able to unravel this thing in such a way that people which are basically viewed as being similar have similar responses, and questions which are viewed as being similar have sort of predictable responses. So on a given question, I would say two questions are related. If knowing the response to one, I can infer across the population the response to the other. So the situation is, can you take something like that, which is sort of our basic example that we are going to use, and unravel it so that columns which are nearby each other will have similar responses, and rows nearby will have similar responses. As you can see, this is done in this grouping that is done here, which again, I will explain how the grouping is done. So you see that this group here between this submatrix that is displayed has the property that all the columns are more or less the same profile, and all the rows are more or less the same profile. And so it's like a barcode in that sense. And that was extracted out of this basic garbage here. Now, there are several points that I will address later on once we understand the analytic structure that reveals that. One of them is you want to know, you want to be able to compute all kinds of functions on the data. So this is a questionnaire here, which is some sort of psychological questionnaire. And let's say some of the people, say psychologists have evaluated their depression score, for example. And what you want to know is you want to basically extrapolate from the people that you have been tested and analyzed, extrapolate a depression score for everybody else in some way. So this sounds now like the typical learning task in machine learning, which is you have some empirical function, you want to extend it to the rest of the universe, and you want to do it as reliably as possible. But there are other things that happen here. You want to know if some people are basically should be thrown out of the questionnaire because responding to 570 questions is tiring, and after a while you say no to everything. So basically detection of anomalies and outliers is part of it. Processing this, so not just processing the actual data that you are given, but in a way build a machine that allows you to process essentially all functions which on that geometry that you have discovered have some sort of regularity. And so we need, all those words need to be defined. And while the poetry is very nice, the issue is what is the underlying mathematics behind it. So here's another example which will be linked to some physics problem in a minute. So here's the issue. I have this image above. You can think of the colors as basically being gray levels, right? And then this image, if the color is a gray level, you could think of every pixel as being a coin, and you toss the coin, you either get heads or tails. So if it's heads, you set 0. If it's tails, you set 1. And then you display those black and white 1 bit per pixel. This is, by the way, the kind of thing that will happen when you convert an image to a fax image where you want to send 1 bit per pixel. this is one way of doing it. So what the eye will see is some sort of average of neighboring pixel, and you'll see the grade level naturally. But here we do things much worse. We take this gray level image and we permute the columns and rows, and now it looks exactly like this questionnaire image that we saw a minute ago. And one test is, can you recover from that the original image? And what you see at the bottom is a recovery from the gray level images from the third row here. So from that thing, you see a recovery of that image, actually from this thing where you had the grade level. Really, this is a grade level of this thing. You can also have the black and white, and we'll recover it just the same. So the question is, so it's clear that one needs to do several things. One is, if I knew which column was close to which other columns, if I had the order of the columns, geometry of the columns, geometry of the rows, it's not such a big deal because you'll just take boxes, you'll average on the boxes, and that will do the job. The point is you don't know any of that. And what you want to do is discover it and recover sort of the underlying structure that is in there. This image, by the way, is related to what I see here. So here's another example in mathematics, or in physics for that matter. So the situation is this: you have this body here, okay? And what you're doing is you have in a given region, let's say in this region or this region, you have some source, which is basically some function which emits a sound, and you will hear the sound everywhere else on the surface. So the mathematical operator for that is, what you have here is a Green's function for the acoustic Helmholtz operator. Assume that at y you have some source f of y, and at x you will measure you'll have some receivers which will measure this integral transformation on that. So in this situation, so this is a typical analytic situation that you want to understand exactly what happens to a given distribution of sources under some physical process. The other way you can look at it is look at it as a question. Look at the matrix or the kernel e to the I k x minus y over x minus y as a function of two variables. So think of y as living on this curve here, and x as living on the curve. I don't really care about, this thing is empty in here. I don't really care about, I just want to know how does one point affect another point out there across this particular curve. And you can do analysis quite well, and it's usually done by doing, the simplest thing is what is called geometric optics or billiards optic. But the issue is somebody basically doesn't tell you anything about where the points are. Basically put some Dirac mass here and measure things somewhere else. You get a matrix, which is this kernel. And this kernel, if you look at the real part of it, looks like that. Okay, so it's like the image we had a minute ago. And so the issue is you have that, but assume instead of having such a pretty picture, it's all the columns and all the rows are garbled, and you want to recover the basic geometry and interaction of the different locations on the curve, and you want to do this effectively. And you see you have all those boxes here. So you want it, each one of the boxes is characterized by the fact that to the first approximation, it's quite homogeneous and simple. And you can represent it very simply with 1 or 2 or 3 numbers, depending on the precisions that you have. Those numbers, and this would be a reflection of what is called geometric optics. Again, I'm not getting into that. I'm just telling you that the problem that we are looking at, whether it's a psychological questionnaire or gene arrays or an acoustic propagation or any kind of physical situation, will give rise to a database. Very often we don't have geometry, so points are, the labels of points are random and the labels of the features are random. Okay, so let me explain the process that we are going to follow. And let me explain it in terms of basically natural language. What I'm saying with natural language, we do things which are quite complicated. We have vocabulary, which is sort of a basic, I would say, a small atom of the language. And then we have concepts, which are collections of such things. And concepts themselves could occur at various levels of generality. And then you have documents, and documents themselves have different topics, right? They can deal with different topics. And so the precision of the topic is a way of associating document to each other. And again, there's also a level of generality of the topical description of documents. So my point here is that every database, every matrix like the one we had here, should be viewed as a collection of documents. And when we match columns for each other, say, if I want to match two documents to each other by their vocabulary, okay, so I have a document, and let's say that I have a lexicon, which is a collection of maybe a few thousand words or maybe more. And for each one of the words, I measure the occurrence of that word, frequency of occurrence, or just whether it occurred or didn't occur, doesn't matter much. And then I compare two documents to each other by the co-occurrence of vocabulary in them, okay? So I could say two documents are similar if they have basically the same vocabulary in them. And I don't particularly worry about where in the document the vocabulary happens. So it's very clear that if I take, say, document in science, then documents in biology will have very similar vocabulary, and documents in physical sciences or mathematics or something else will have different kind of vocabularies. So the issue is that I can't try to organize a body of documents by similarity of vocabulary. The first thing is that this is bound to crash. Like, it cannot really work very well because you can have documents dealing with exactly the same topic in which the vocabulary choices are quite different, because words, you can interchange words because they have similar meaning, or maybe there are several ways of fitting the words to the content that you wish. And sometimes for stylistic reason, you choose different words. So the words are sort of fuzzy in terms of their similarities, or the documents could be fuzzy in terms of similarities. You could have two documents with quite different vocabulary, but basically having essentially the same topic. So you have to be able to match documents to each other, not just by comparing individual words, but trying to extract from the vocabulary concepts and define concepts, and then characterize a document not just by the words, but by the various concepts occurring in the document. And I'll define concept and all of that mathematically in a few minutes, okay? Similarly, when you want to know whether words represent the same, should be linked to each other because they are dealing with the same topic, what you have to do is, say, take two words and see how predictable is the occurrence of one word in terms of the occurrence of the other word, right? So certain words, for example, like cells, will occur the word cell will occur quite a bit in biological documents or proteins and so on. So cells will, there will be a linkage between the word cells to some other words like maybe protein, genes, or things of that sort. But that will depend on the context, right? And the issue is you need to define, so in terms of the documents, you need to define topics, which I will call context in this case. And in terms of words, I need to define concepts, which are groups of words, which basically tend to co-occur in the same groups of documents. Okay, so our goal here is we want to define a good document distance, a distance between documents which is content flexible, and a distance between words which is conceptual. Okay, once I have those distances, I can start to organize documents if I wish, and I can also organize words if I wish. So in natural language, we do this always, but think of the situation where what you have, the documents are, say, cells, and the vocabulary are genes, and the appearance of the activity of a gene in a given cell, in a given environment, is really what we need to organize. So we need to basically build the language, if you wish, of the genes and the language of the documents, which are the cells, simultaneously. They go together because they're very much context and concept driven, if you wish. So again, everything I said here is abstract poetry. I need to make it concrete, and we'll see what happens. So we are going to look at one example, how things work, and then we'll go into the mathematics of that. The mathematics, by the way, is going to be critical at some point because it will allow us to understand the precision of the language that we are just building. Okay. So this example below is the one we have seen a minute ago. So it's the MMPI questionnaire, which is a Minnesota multiphasing personality inventory. It's designed to assess dysfunction of responders. Basically, everybody who goes to prison or a government job or anything like this has to take this questionnaire. The questionnaire has about 570 questions. You will see a few of them in a few minutes. And people have to respond to all of that. As you expect, it's probably one of the most hated questionnaires around because it's a major job to respond to 570 questions without giving up, right? And so here we have 3,000 people roughly and 570 questions. This is the data we have. So we are going to build a metric on the people. So basically we want to define a distance between people and a distance between questions, which will convert this whole database into a very smooth database, as smooth as possible. And I'll define the word smooth. Smoothness will be defined in terms of the distance. So our goal here is to discover distances, one on the columns, one on the rows. This is very much like the task that Anna Gilbert was discussing in her talk a few weeks ago, which is how do you build optimal distances for various tasks? So here we are trying to build two tree-like distances, one on the columns, one on the rows. The trees are going to be very simple trees, binary trees, but they don't have to be that. One can be fancier. And to see how well we can do in terms of organizing this information here, in fact, getting information out of this mess so that we can actually make a lot of prediction. Okay, so the simplest joint organization that is going to be achieved in the following way. We will build some sort of binary hierarchical organization of the columns of the people into groups of people which basically have similar responses. So in other words, they correlate. If you compare the profile of responses, two people are going to be similar if they responded, say, to 99% of the questions in the same way. Okay, and then you can make it coarser by taking 90% of the questions, and you can organize this in a variety of ways. I'll show you in a minute how. Okay, so now we not only will have an organization of individuals, but you'll also have groups of individuals which are basically similar people. Okay, once you have this, we are going to call those groups of people, say, let's call them meta people. So they are basically some sort of blurred response of groups of people who tend to respond the same way. Now, for every question, we can match two questions to each other by, again, seeing across the population how frequently, if the answer is yes to one question, it would be yes to the other question too. And that would give me, so just correlating the responses across the population, that'll give me some affinity between questions. And then I could also define a coarser affinity between questions by just looking at the response of groups of people to questions and assign some weight to groups of people as being more precise than individuals. So you'll have, this will allow me to organize the questions into groups of questions which tend to have similar responses. And those groups, I will call them conceptual folders of questions. And I can use those groups of questions as being conceptual. And so now, once I've done that, I can return to the population and not only look at the individual responses to individual questions, but for any given person, look at the response of the average response of the person to groups of conceptual questions. And again, we will see this in detail. At this point, this is just a process that I'm describing. It's sort of an iterative process designed to optimize some sort of entropy of the matrix that we are going to organize. Okay, so here, this is again another way of describing what I've just said. So I've built a binary tree of people, and this binary tree is down at the bottom. Okay, here you see, top node is the whole population, and I've broken the population into two groups, the left side and the right side. In this case, the two groups, so each one of the persons here has a psychological score. I'm doing this here just to illustrate. Those numbers here what you see on the top here is the scores that psychologists gave to people. And the average score, say number 3 is a depression score. The other one is some other psychological conditions. And they are listed here. The average score of everybody is 0. And the scale here is basically a standard deviation. If the score is positive, it means that the person is dysfunctional. If it's negative, it is extremely stable and functional. So you see this split here into this left side and right side had the properties that the average score on the left is quite dysfunctional, and the average score on the right is quite functional, okay? If you look at the dysfunctional group, which is the one here on the left, which is isolated here, you may want to say, I can split this into two subgroups, which are as different from each other as possible. And there are different ways of achieving that. I'll describe what we do here in a minute. But so here, when I look at this particular group of more dysfunctional people, they break down into the left node and the right node. The left node is more or less close to average, and the right one is much more dysfunctional. So the main contribution to dysfunction is on the right, and the left is a little bit better. By the way, right, left, and so on is completely random. They're not, that has nothing to do with anything. It's just a partition. This is what you have here is what is called the partition tree, in which I partitioned the population initially into two groups, which are as disparate from each other as possible. Then I take each one of those and break it up into two groups as different from each other as possible, and can go down the tree to get a binary tree. So I build a binary tree. The way usually, the simplest way to actually achieve, say, the first partitioning is to construct a graph on the population, which is based on how similar they are initially, and look at the second eigenvector of the graph, and that would be positive on the left and negative on the right, or vice versa. And that gives you an initial partition. And then you keep doing that. You look at this subpopulation, you repeat the same, and you get the same. So this has been something that people have been doing for years now. And it's a very simple way of breaking up data into a binary tree. Now, if I were to do, yes,
Rafi, actually,
yes,
I think we have a question from the audience.
yes,
Regarding the questions of the questionnaire.
yes.
In particular, do you also look at dissimilar questions? For example, questions that are anti-correlated. So for example, the answer to one is yes, the answer to
Yes.
another is no, but they're sort of getting at the same thing.
Yes, and so I'll respond to that. It's a great question, and in fact, it's an issue. Is that the response? Every question can have two answers, yes or no, right? I mean, basically, every question can be formulated in two ways, right? Do you like your parents? Do you hate your parents, right? And so the issue is how do you, if you wish, reorient the questionnaire in such a way that they're all depolarize the questionnaire, if you wish. And so we did that by using a very simple trick, which is we ask every question twice, okay? You ask the question in a positive sense, and then you ask the question in a negative sense. Now we have a double questionnaire, and this one breaks into two groups very simply, a left group and a right group, and those two groups are depolarized. Okay, because they're already organized in such a way that two questions have the same polarity, if you wish. So we do that. You need to depolarize because the sign of the response is random, or the formulation of the question is random. So we need to de-randomize that by the structure of the whole questionnaire. In this case, it can be done, and we have done that. So this is a depolarized questionnaire that you have seen. It's a great question. Okay, and there are several ways of doing that, but again. Now, if you look at the picture above it, you see what you have is sort of the original database that of sort of the random grade level boxes that, there was, which was reorganized, and I reorganized a few slides back into a situation where you saw some partition of this, of the columns and the rows in the different subgroups. And that partition gave us barcodes. One of the pictures I had is a barcode on one of the points of the partition. The point I'm making is that really the organization that one gets is the original matrix as a sum of simple matrices, which are simple on each one of the sub matrices, which are product of partition elements. And the whole matrix is the sum of all of those. So it's sort of layered in transparency mode. And again, I'll explain that. It's really quite important because there are lots of structure within structures within structures. And somehow you want to, if you wish, find the different layers for whatever tasks you may have in there. One of the tasks may be identify if somebody is lying, for example. And so you will see this very, very easily. By the way, this questionnaire also need not be a full database. It could just be, let's say, like the Netflix database where you have all kinds of people and all kinds of movies, and they have their rating of the movies. And the matrix that you have is really mostly empty and has a lot of noise. And you want to be able to synthesize and fill in the missing entries in some clever way. And so one of the things that will come up is what is a reasonable way of doing that. And by the way, again, in the example of the Netflix is quite nice in some ways, because let's say you want to say, you have a given movie and a given person, the person hasn't seen the movie, you want to know how would the person evaluate the movie. Well, what you could do is match the person with other people with the same taste and see among those other people how they would evaluate the movie and then give some sort of average score. But other people with the same taste occurs at various resolutions of how do you define taste, right? And you may, instead of looking just at one movie, you may look at other movies, maybe with the same actors or other movies in the same of the same genre and see how they were evaluated, and combine all of those things at different scales, at different resolutions. And one of my goals is to show you that this can be done in a completely systematic, meaningful way. And we'll get there shortly. By the way, initially my intention was to have the whole lecture just to run this software that we are seeing transparencies of, which I did in class, and I found out it took me at least an hour and a half. So I cut it down to that level, and it's like that. In any case, so here's the story. So what we did here, okay, coming back, I built this binary tree on this thing here, and once we build the binary tree, it allows us to build a metric based on that tree, which is a tree metric, which allows me to build a graph on the columns and a graph on the rows. So a tree metric is something very simple. You take two, if you look at the columns here, the distance between two people will be the size of the smallest folder containing the two people. Okay, so I will go down, if two people are in this group, the distance between them, if this is the smallest folder containing them, will be about the level that I have here. So tree metrics have several major advantages over standard metrics, which is they're very easy to process, and they're also very easy to relate to conventional metrics in many cases, and this is just a computational tool. So based on that tree metric, here is a population. You could embed the population in Euclidean space, so every person corresponds to a point in here. And again, at the end of the talk, I will describe various embedding mechanisms, which are very simple to do that. By the way, when you are dealing with vocabulary, the embedding of vocabulary is called word to vec. Here, this is people to vec, really, right? I'm embedding a person as a point in 3D. And the idea would be that different groups on the binary trees that you have seen there will be organized, will be visible here. Unlike the binary tree, here groups which are close to each other in this geometry really are close to each other in terms of the responses that they have in the questionnaire. So the group that is highlighted here is, you will see it in a minute on the binary tree, is a group of highly dysfunctional people. This is the dysfunction scores of all those people. Okay, it's a one that you will see in a second. So you see this is a depression score, which is substantially bigger than 0. And this is a group. So the idea is to build an atlas of the population. The atlas is what's described here. The different regions here, which are the different colors, are the different different countries or folders of people, which have similar response profile. And on this atlas, so you see that those people are particularly dysfunctional. If I go to a different region, this is a different region on the other extremity. By the way, this curve here that you see, this skeleton that you see, is sort of a dysfunction curve on people. So if you're here, you're perfectly okay. If you're out here, you have all kinds of problems. So here, this is the other extreme. And you see the people here are extremely stable in terms of all those scores. By the way, in this computation, the scores, I'm displaying them here, this is external information provided to us by psychologists for validation of the mathematical process of organizing the data. So the organization of the data doesn't know anything about that. The conclusion is that if you have this atlas, you can very easily infer from the atlas what the condition of a given person or given dot is by just picking a dot and, picking a dot and looking at the neighborhood of the dot. If you know something about them, you immediately can infer everything about their condition. So for example, you picked a dot here and you want to know what is the depression score of this guy. Well, you look at the few neighbors. if you know some of their scores, you automatically have the score of this one. You don't have to do anything else. It just, the whole geometry is designed to do that. Okay, so let me come back. So this particular node that we have just seen a minute ago is right here. So this is a population of people. So the whole population of people is here. The subpopulation of stable one is here. The subpopulation of more stable and more stable are here. Those people here are the collection of red points here. So you immediately see that. And on this level, there are basically 16 subpopulations, which is going to become relevant in a minute. So let me do the same thing on the side of the questions themselves. Okay, so here I organize the questions by their similarity. So the questions are, I took two groups of questions, basically on the binary tree here. So this is a binary tree of questions. And so this particular group of questions is the one that appears in, you will read them in a second, that appears above. And you see that in the population, the people here responded very negatively to those questions, and the people here responded positively to those questions. And let's see what it means. First of all, those are the functional people, those are totally dysfunctional people. But here, I don't need to have external information. This is all data-driven. So let's look at the questions. Those questions are, I'm almost never bothered by pains over my heart or in my chest. I hardly ever feel pain in the back of my neck. So those are health questions. Okay, so anybody who responded yes is pretty healthy. And I was wrong here. So the functional group is here. The response was very strongly positive. The dysfunctional group was here. So here's another group of questions. And let's look at them. I find it hard to keep my mind on a task or job. I'm certainly lacking in self-confidence. I have difficulty in starting to do things. Even when I'm with people, I feel lonely much of the time. I've several times given up doing things because I saw too little of my ability. You see, they're all part of the same conceptual dysfunction, I would say, right? A person is insecure and depressed and unconnected to his environment. And those questions, bear in mind, nobody read the questions, okay? The grouping of the question was done strictly from the gray, from the black and white dots that you had before. And again, you see the group, those questions, no, this is not what I had. So I don't have them, I did not select them on the questionnaire. So those are the questions that we selected just a minute ago. Okay, so I'm finished with those displays. Let me try to explain a little bit more what one does, what is the mathematics that goes in there. So number one thing, let me just say this, when you have a binary tree like that, you may not, there's always attached to it a collection of functions, elementary functions, which are the Haar functions of the tree. So the Haar function is this. So the binary tree is what? You have the whole population. So you can view the whole population as being the function 1. And then you can break the population down into the two half populations. So now you can define a function which is -1 here and +1 here. And that's obviously, and weigh it appropriately by the size. Let's assume the size is the same. So this particular function, which is -1 here and +1 here, which basically builds a contrast between the two subpopulations, is obviously orthogonal to the constant function 1, because half the time it's positive, half the time is negative. Then you look at the function at this location here, you break it into this one and that one, and you look at the function which is -1 here and +1 here, rescaled appropriately, and that's orthogonal to the functions I had here, and you set it to be 0 out on the other side. This collection of elementary contrast function, which basically contrasts between left and right nodes of the two halves of a tree, are called Haar functions. They form an orthogonal collection of functions, and so that you can take any function on the data here and always expand it in terms of those Haar functions. Now, once you have, so I have a tree like this with an orthogonal basis. This is a tree of questions on the questions. And then I have a tree like this with an orthogonal basis on the people. So I have two sets of functions, orthogonal functions on the people, orthogonal functions on the population. So in reality, I have functions which are basically defined on the whole data. Okay, so basically, so let me introduce notation. If you look at R as basically as a product of a folder of questions with a folder of people, a folder would be just a subset selected in the tree of the question times a folder of the people, which is another subset. So rectangle, R is for rectangle. It's a rectangular submatrix of the full matrix. So there is, to each rectangular submatrix, I can associate a function which is +1, -1, +1, -1 on the four pieces of the rectangle. And basically they're called the Haar-like basis function. Now, one of the points I want to make is that those functions are absolutely amazing objects. They have been essentially, while they have been known for, I would say, at least 70, 80 years, the tensor product functions, the one I'm describing here, have been neglected, and some things have been discovered about them over the last 40, 50 years. I'll get to that. And they're quite remarkable in their ability to compress and capture the properties of functions of x and y, or of I and j, of two variables. So I'm going to quickly describe some things on there before I sort of move further along. This is getting fast. So basically, the point is this: if I take any function, any matrix at all, so think of f here as a function of all the points in the array, then I can very easily, if I have such a function and I expand it in this basis, if the sum of the coefficients of the expansion is bounded by a constant, this way 1, then I know that the function can be approximated extremely efficiently by a Haar expansion. And I also know something about the smoothness of the function. I'm accelerating my talk now because it's reaching the end and I have a lot more to say. But basically, the one thing that one can show is that if a function is smooth relative to the tree metric, in the sense that the value of the function at a point minus the value of the function at another point is less than the distance between them to some power, then the coefficients are less than the area of the corresponding rectangle to some power, and they're usually all quite small. If the function is such that the sum of the coefficients is finite, then it's most of the time the matrix is smooth. It need not be smooth everywhere, but let me describe what I mean by smoothness. So assume, assume that I have a matrix Mij, which is smooth in the sense that as I move, I take 4 points ij, and I move to I prime j, ij prime, and I prime j prime. In other words, I have a rectangle I like this, which has 4 endpoints, and I move along the rectangle like this. The function changes like the product of the distances between the I and I prime, j and j prime. Such a function is called biholder, and you would ask, why would I care? It looks like an obscenity, and you'll see in a minute that it's a quite an amazing property. So this, by the way, is sort of a curvature kind condition. It tells me that if I want to calculate the function as I prime and j prime, and I know the 3 other values here, I can calculate this with error, which is quadratic in the which is in the product of the distances, which is quadratic, much higher precision. Okay, so the remarkable thing is this. So about 50 years ago, maybe more, 70 years ago, a Russian mathematician named Smolyak showed that if you have a function satisfying this condition, so it's a matrix function, if you wish, on a large matrix, maybe 1,000,000 by 1,000,000 or something like this, and you want to sample it, the number of samples you need to have to guarantee a precision is relatively small. It's proportional to 1 over the error that you want to achieve to some small power. Generally speaking, when you want to approximate the function, it's a disaster. And the way this approximation is done by Smolyak is that you need to find what is called a sparse grid, which I will explain in a second. And the remarkable thing is that last year, Nicholas Marshall, who is my former student, proved that it's enough to pick a random collection of points with roughly the same complexity. So let me explain here this thing just in a second. This will be a mathematical, a little bit of mathematics, and then we'll skip back to examples. So here is for a matrix, each one of the submatrices that we could construct based on the binary tree with 3 levels. So here is the top, split in 2, split in 3, top, split in 2, split in 3. All the submatrices, this is the full matrix. This is split the columns in 2, and split the rows in 2, and split both of them in 2. So the product of the 2 binary trees gives rise to all kinds of rectangles R, which are listed here. And those rectangles R, which are listed, each one has a center. And basically, Smolyak's theorem says that if I want to evaluate the full matrix to some precision, all I need to do is just evaluate it at all those highlighted centers, and I'll have a precision which is of the order of the area of all of the leftover rectangles. So in this case, let's say the area here is 1/8. So my precision is going to be of the order of 1/8. If I went many, say 10 levels, the area would be much, much smaller. So this thing is for for D tensors. So for 3 dimensions, this is a 3 tensor. You can do the same thing. You can have a tree on the rows and trees on the column, a tree on the other thing. The same thing is happening. So you are in a position to evaluate matrices, which are volume matrices, which are monumentally occupied with points, right? Already the square is a large number, but the cube is, if you have a, say, 1,000 by 1,000 by 1,000 data set, that's 1 billion points. It tells you that in order to evaluate everything in the data set, you don't need that. You just need roughly 1,000 times log of 1,000 to the power 2 to evaluate that. So this theorem of Marshall is here. The reference is, it's just in the archive now. So this is the end, basically the end of my talk here, but let me just show you that this can, I'm going to skip quite a bit of things here. I'm saying one thing that happened, the metrics that we picked to match the documents or the folders to each other is really called an earth mover distance, which allows you to compare things which are sort of flexible version of each other. I'm going to skip all of this here, but I want to get to an example, which is this example. So this is a 3D database in which you monitor, say, the brain of a mouse or the activity in the cortex of the mouse. This database is, there are basically 60 experiments. Each experiment is a video. Each video is looking at that, and you want to organize to understand what the dynamics is, what's going on, and everything. So it's a 3D situation. So you have a matrix. Once you fix one experiment, you have the different pixels and over time, and you have the neurons, and you have the 3 axes, trials, neuron, and so on. When you organize them, just like we did with the 3D questionnaire, so the first thing that happens is, so the data is on the left. you want to organize the structures, the neurons. What you see is pixels. You don't know which pixel is what, and you don't see neurons and so on. So the documents, the topics and so on are basically those neurons that you need to extract, which you see very nicely. But then you want to understand also the dynamics and everything. And this is done by, here you compare different experiments. As again, you see that contrary to what you would think, the mouse is doing exactly the same thing, but his brain activity looks quite different. And so the problem is that what is the notion of distance between dynamics that we have here and dynamics that we have there? And it's not completely obvious. We need very flexible distances. And this kind of transportation distances that we are using allow you to do that. But let me just say, finish with one more thing here. This is, go up here, which is this: how do you embed data in Euclidean space? So in natural language processing, you can build a kernel, which is, you can just measure for any two words, X and Y, say the frequency of their occurrence within distance 10 in a body of documents. So you get that. So now you say, I have this matrix of all vocabulary, and I can look at the eigenvectors of that matrix. The eigenvectors of that matrix will give me coordinates and will give me a word-to-vec embedding, very simply. You can also look at points on a manifold and say, well, what is the probability that 2 points are close to each other? And again, you can do a diffusion process. And based on that diffusion process, you can decide, you get a kernel, which is e to the geodesic distance in a given range, and you can use the eigenvector of that, which are eigenvectors Laplacian, and they give you coordinates on the data. Those coordinates, by the way, are the ones that were used to identify the neurons in the picture before. And now, just one last word, and I'm finished. Recently, we have been trying to sort of do the thing using deep nets, not using the neural net to compute embeddings which are intrinsic in the same sense that the eigenvectors are intrinsic if you have a probabilistic kernel. And so let me give you an example here, which is this example. So we have this collection of points on the northern hemisphere of the sphere here, and they're all projected down to 2D. And what you observe is the 2D things, but you don't observe the full hemisphere. Somehow the South Pole region has not been observed at all. And what you want to do is, based on those two-dimensional observation, recover an embedding of the data into Euclidean space so that all the regions that you have, each one of the green regions here in the Euclidean space will be the restriction of a ball in Euclidean space to the data. So this is the analog of a Nash embedding that you want to get. You want to embed this collection of points in a Riemannian manifold so that each one of the balls that you have are Riemannian, are basically induced Riemannian balls from the thing. So in other words, the data that you have up here is z-scored white data in the sense that the coordinates are all uniform and all done. And so a neural net can do that beautifully. This is work done recently by, it's listed in the below by Ophir Lindenbaum and Erez Peter-Freund and many other people. And the point here that is remarkable is that we did not see the South Polar region, but the neural net extrapolated it beautifully. So you see down here, it filled up the region. There's no eigenvectors or anything. The paradigm here for embedding it in Euclidean space is more of an isometric paradigm in which you want the data to be z-scored. Now, if the data that you had arose in nature from some control manifold or something like this, you cannot do it at all scales, but for each scale at a time, you can do it. So those are other examples of that point. So there's much more here, as you can see. An hour is a short time if you want to go into details. But anyway, the PowerPoint presentation is available, and most of the details, or much of the detail, is in this talk I gave at the ICM and the references in there. So I think I will finish here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Rafi. We'll now open it up for some questions. Of course, if the panelists have any questions, they can ask them directly. And if any of the attendees have questions, you can submit them through the Q&A and we'll ask them.